I caught my husband with my son's fiancée a week before their wedding. I wanted to tell everyone, but my son stopped me. Mom, I know it's part of my plan. What he came up with and did at the wedding. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret, and I was 63 years old when my entire world cracked open like old porcelain dropped on a kitchen floor. You don't expect that at 63. You expect grandchildren, Sunday dinners, maybe a bad knee. You don't expect to walk into your own home and see your husband of 38 years kissing the woman your son was about to marry. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where things still made sense. Our house in Connecticut had always been full of noise, good noise. The kind that means people love being there. My son Daniel was 31, broad-shouldered, careful with his words the way his father never was. He called me every Sunday without fail. Even from college, even during his years working in Chicago, he called. That was Daniel, steady, loyal, the kind of man I'd raised deliberately, with intention. His father, Richard, was 65, a retired architect with silver hair and the easy confidence of a man who had never been seriously questioned by anyone who mattered to him. We had a good marriage, or I believed we did. 38 years. A shared mortgage, shared vacations, shared grief when my mother died. I thought I knew every room of that man the way I knew every room of our house. Then Vanessa came into our lives. She appeared 18 months before the wedding, introduced at a family dinner as Daniel's girlfriend. She was 28, dark-haired, with the kind of beauty that announces itself before a woman even opens her mouth. She worked in marketing, something with luxury brands, and she wore her ambition like expensive perfume, lightly, strategically, so you only caught it when she leaned in close. I liked her at first, or I tried to. She was polished and attentive, asked me about my garden, complimented my cooking, remembered details from previous conversations. That should have been charming. But somewhere in the second month, I noticed she remembered details the way a person reviews notes before a meeting. Efficiently, purposefully. It didn't feel like warmth. It felt like preparation. Richard, on the other hand, took to her immediately. Too immediately, I thought, though I said nothing. He laughed louder when she was in the room. He refreshed his wardrobe that autumn. Nothing dramatic, just newer shirts, better fitted trousers. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself I was the kind of woman who looked for problems that didn't exist. The first real signal came 4 months before the wedding. I had driven home early from a garden club meeting that was canceled due to a water pipe burst at the community center. Richard's car was in the driveway, which wasn't unusual. He was semi-retired and worked from home several days a week. Vanessa's car was also there, which was less expected. Daniel was at work. I walked in through the side door, the one that opens directly into the kitchen, and I heard voices from the living room. Low voices. The specific low of people who don't want to be overheard. I stood still in the kitchen and listened. I am not proud of that. But something in my chest had already gone cold, and my feet would not move. I couldn't hear words, just tone. Richard's voice, warm and murmuring. Vanessa's laugh, quiet and different from the laugh she used around Daniel. Smaller, more real. I walked into the doorway. They were on the sofa. Richard's hand was at the back of her neck. Her face was turned up toward his, the posture of two people who had done this before and expected privacy. They separated the moment they heard my step on the hardwood. Richard stood up too quickly. Vanessa smoothed her hair. "Margaret," Richard said, with the measured calm of a man who had prepared for this possibility. "You're home early." I looked at him. I looked at her. I looked at the space between them, which told me everything that words could not. "I am," I said. And then I walked back to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and stood at the sink, looking out at my garden, the roses I had planted the year Daniel was born, now 31 years old and still blooming. And I thought about what I had just seen, and what it meant, and what on earth I was going to do about it. I didn't cry. Not then. That surprised me. What I felt instead was something quieter and more dangerous than tears. It was the feeling of a door closing, very softly, behind me. The sound of one era ending, and underneath that, just barely audible, like a note struck at the edge of hearing. Something that might, eventually, become a plan. I stood at that kitchen sink for a long time. Outside, the roses were doing what roses do in late October, holding on past their season, stubborn and vivid against the gray. I had planted the yellow ones the spring Daniel was born, the red ones the year Richard got his first big commission, the white ones after my mother's funeral because she had loved white flowers and I needed something living to tend. 38 years of a life arranged in a garden. I heard Vanessa leave. The front door opened and closed with careful quietness. The sound of a person managing their exit. Richard did not come to the kitchen immediately. He gave it 10 minutes, which told me he was composing himself, finding the right architecture of explanation. When he came in, I was sitting at the table with my hands flat on the surface, the way I used to sit when Daniel was a teenager, and had done something that required a serious conversation. "Margaret, don't," I said. Just the one word. He stopped. We sat across from each other in the kitchen we had remodeled together in 2009, with the countertops I had chosen and the window he had designed, and the silence between us had a shape and a weight I had never felt before in 38 years of marriage. "How long?" I asked. He looked at the table. That told me it was not new. 7 months, he said. 7 months. Vanessa had been in our lives for 18. The affair had begun roughly halfway through her relationship with my son. While Daniel was choosing engagement rings, his father was conducting a secret. While I was helping Vanessa select a wedding venue, she was sleeping with my husband. I did not scream. I want you to understand that I am not the screaming kind. What I felt was a deep, geological shift, the kind that doesn't make noise at the surface but rearranges everything underneath. "Does Daniel know?" I asked. "No," Richard said. "Of course not. Of course not." As though that were the obvious boundary, the one line of decency preserved in all of this. I stood up, went to the bedroom, and locked the door. I sat on the edge of our bed. My side, the left side, always. And I took inventory of my situation the way a person takes inventory after a flood. What was damaged? What could be salvaged? What was simply gone? Financially, I was not helpless. I had worked as a hospital administrator until 5 years ago and had my own retirement accounts, my own savings. The house was in both our names. Connecticut divorce law was equitable distribution. I knew these facts the way a person knows the location of the fire extinguisher. You hope you'll never need it. But you've looked. Emotionally, the damage was harder to calculate. I had been a faithful wife. I had been a good partner. I had built a life around a man who had decided at 65 that he preferred my son's fiancée. And then there was Daniel. This was where my thinking stopped, again and again, like a car stalling on ice. My son was going to marry this woman in 6 weeks. He had bought a ring. He had put down a deposit on a venue in Vermont, a restored barn that Vanessa had chosen, and he had agreed to because he wanted her to be happy. He had invited 90 guests. He had written vows. I knew because he had asked for my help with the phrasing 2 weeks ago, sitting at the same table. If I told him now what would happen, he would be shattered. The wedding would collapse. 90 people would have flights and hotels booked. And Vanessa Vanessa would deny everything, or cry, or turn it into a story about Richard pursuing her. And Daniel would be left to sort through wreckage with no solid ground under him. I wanted to tell him. Every instinct I had said, "Tell your son. Protect your son." But I also knew Daniel. And I knew that if I walked into his apartment tomorrow and said the words, he would react from the rawest part of himself, and the rawness would make things unpredictable. He might confront Richard publicly. He might believe Vanessa over me. He might, and this frightened me most, blame himself. So I made a decision that cost me something. I would wait. I would think. I would not act from pain. I would act from strategy. I had spent 35 years managing a hospital department, coordinating doctors and administrators and budgets and crises. I knew how to stay calm when the situation was not calm. I knew how to gather information before making a decision that couldn't be unmade. By midnight, in that locked bedroom while Richard slept on the couch downstairs, I had the outline of a plan. It was not complicated. It did not involve revenge fantasies or dramatic confrontations. It involved documentation, timing, and one phone call that I was not yet ready to make, but would be soon. The first step was simple. I needed to know the full extent of what I was dealing with. A 7-month affair might have a paper trail: texts, emails, receipts for hotel rooms or restaurants. Richard was not a careful man in the way that careful men are careful. He was careful about appearances, about surfaces. He was not careful about his phone. I was not going to be impulsive. I was not going to be emotional in a way that could be used against me. I was 63 years old, and I had buried my mother, survived a cancer scare, raised a good man largely on my own while my husband built his career, and managed a department of 40 people through a global pandemic. I was more than capable of handling this. I just needed to be smart. The next morning, I behaved with complete normalcy, which is harder than it sounds. I made coffee. I set 2 cups on the counter, Richard's dark roast, mine with milk. I asked if he wanted eggs. He looked at me with the cautious expression of a man waiting for a bomb to detonate, and when the bomb did not detonate, he grew more cautious still. Normal behavior after a revelation is unnerving to people who expect hysteria. I had learned that in hospital management, the quieter you are, the more power you hold. We did not discuss what had happened. I had told him 2 nights before that I needed time to think before we spoke further, and he had nodded with the relief of a man granted a reprieve he knew he didn't deserve. Richard was many things, but he was not a confrontation seeker. He preferred problems to resolve themselves or to be handled by someone else. What he did not know was that my thinking was already done. Over the following week, I moved carefully. I did not touch his phone directly, not yet. Instead, I started with what I knew: our joint bank statements. I had always managed our household finances. Richard handled his professional accounts. I handled the domestic ones, and for years this division had been seamless and boring. Now I looked at the statements for the past 8 months with new eyes. There were anomalies, nothing obvious. Richard was too architecturally precise for obvious, but there were cash withdrawals of $300 or $400 at irregular intervals, always on weekdays. There were restaurant charges in New Haven and Hartford, cities 40 minutes from our home, far enough to be unlikely but close enough to be plausible if questioned. There was a hotel charge in Providence from March, when Richard had told me he was attending an architectural conference. I had not verified this at the time because I had no reason to. I photographed each statement with my phone, organized by date. This took 4 evenings. On the 5th day, I called my attorney. Barbara Sloan had handled my mother's estate 6 years ago, and she was the kind of lawyer who listened before she spoke. I drove to her office in Hartford on a Thursday morning, told Richard I had a dentist appointment, and laid out the situation across her desk in 20 minutes. Barbara listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you filing?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "The wedding is in 5 weeks. My son is involved in a way that complicates the timing." She nodded slowly. "You want documentation first?" "I want to understand what I have before I decide what to do with it." She explained what would be relevant in a Connecticut divorce: the financial irregularities, any evidence of the affair's duration, anything that had impacted marital assets. She was careful to note what was legally admissible and what was not. I took notes. When I left her office, I felt something shift in my spine. A straightening, like posture correcting itself after years of a bad chair. The direct evidence came 9 days before the wedding, and it came the way significant things often do, unexpectedly, in an ordinary moment. I had been in Richard's home study to look for the insurance documents. Genuinely, for an unrelated reason, because our car registration was due. Richard was out at what he described as a client lunch. I found the insurance folder. And on his desk, half covered by an architectural magazine, was his personal tablet. I had never looked at Richard's tablet before. It had always been his professional device, the one he used for drawings and client presentations. I had no reason to touch it, but that morning it was open, and on the screen, visible without unlocking anything, was a message thread. The contact name was V. I stood in the doorway of his study for a moment, and I thought about the woman I had been 3 weeks ago, who would have walked away. Then I walked to the desk and I read. 7 months of messages, archived in green and gray. Endearments I recognized as the same cadence Richard had once used with me. Plans made and executed. The Providence Hotel, a weekend in October when I had visited my sister in Philadelphia. Dinners in cities near enough but not too near. And threaded through all of it, Vanessa's voice. Practical, direct, occasionally impatient. She was not in love, I realized, reading her words. She was in management of something she had decided was useful. There was one exchange from 11 days ago that made my hands go very still. Vanessa, he's going to be devastated when this comes out. Have you thought about the timing? Richard, after the wedding. Once she's his wife, it's his problem, not mine. Vanessa, and Margaret? Richard, she'll be fine. She always lands on her feet. I read those 3 lines twice. Then I photographed every screen of that conversation, all the way back to the first message in March. I walked out of his study, put the tablet exactly where it had been, and went to sit in the garden. After the wedding. Once she's his wife, it's his problem. They had planned this. Not the affair as an accident of emotion, but the sequencing, the concealment, the decision to let Daniel marry Vanessa before the truth emerged, and the marriage became Daniel's problem to dissolve. Richard would leave me once Vanessa was safely installed as my son's wife, and Vanessa would, what? Continue? Leave Daniel for his father? The messages didn't make this entirely clear, but the intent was unmistakable. They had both decided to let Daniel walk into a marriage with a woman who was simultaneously involved with his father, and they had decided this deliberately. This was no longer just a marital betrayal. This was a coordinated deception of my son. I called Daniel that evening. He answered on the second ring, voice warm and distracted. "Hey, Mom, what's up? Are you free Saturday?" I asked. "I'd like to have lunch, just the 2 of us." "Sure," he said. "Everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I said. "I just want to see you." There was a small pause. Daniel knew me. "Okay," he said carefully. "Saturday. I'll come to you." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and thought about what I was going to say to my son. And I understood with complete clarity that what I said on Saturday would determine what happened at the wedding. I needed to be precise. I needed to be honest. I needed to trust him. Because what I could not possibly have anticipated, sitting alone in that kitchen with a phone in my hand and 38 years of marriage behind me, was that Daniel already knew. Saturday arrived cold and bright, the way Connecticut does in November. Sky the color of pale slate, leaves finished, the world stripped down to its honest structure. Daniel came at noon. He brought coffee from the bakery in town, the one he knew I liked, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with 2 cups and a look on his face that told me, before either of us said a word, that this was not going to be the conversation I had prepared. "Sit down, Mom," he said. I sat. He set the coffee on the table and sat across from me, and his posture was so much like mine from 2 weeks ago. Hands flat on the surface, spine straight, eyes steady, that I felt something loosen in my chest. He was my son. He had learned composure somewhere. "Tell me what you found," he said. "Daniel?" "Mom." His voice was quiet. "I know about Dad and Vanessa. I've known for 6 weeks." The kitchen went silent in a way that had nothing to do with sound. I looked at my son, 31 years old, jaw set, eyes tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy in private. And I understood that I had not been the only one doing careful math in this family. "How?" I asked. He had received an anonymous text in September. A photo, blurred, taken from a distance but recognizable. Richard and Vanessa outside a restaurant in Hartford. He had not believed it at first. He had done what a careful person does. He had verified. It had taken him 3 weeks of verification to accept what he was looking at. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. "Because you would have told Dad. And Dad would have gone to Vanessa. And then whatever plans she had would have shifted." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "I needed them to not know that I knew." "What plan?" I said. "What are you talking about, Daniel?" He looked at me steadily. "Vanessa isn't in love with Dad," he said. "She's not in love with me either. What Vanessa is interested in is money." He paused. "Dad's money. Or rather, the money she believes Dad has access to, which is partly the money you earned, Mom. Your accounts, the house, the retirement funds. She's been operating under the impression that if she married me, and then the marriage dissolved in some suitably dramatic way, she'd get a settlement. And if she maintained some kind of arrangement with Dad, she'd get another income stream." I stared at him. "I had a private investigator confirm it," Daniel said. 3 weeks ago. She's done this before. Not the exact same structure, but variations. There was a man in Boston 4 years ago. Engaged, then a settlement, then she moved on. The room rearranged itself slightly. I had thought I understood the dimensions of what I was facing. I had been looking at a marital betrayal and a family deception. I had not been looking at a woman who did this professionally. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "We're going to the wedding," Daniel said. And he told me what he had planned. It was precise, and it was devastating. And it was, I realized as he laid it out, something I could not have designed, because it required the groom's authority and the groom's access, and a very specific kind of courage that my son, quietly, had been building for 6 weeks. I agreed to every part of it. I told him about the tablet, the messages, the photographs. He absorbed this with the stillness of someone adding fuel to an engine already running. We were still at the table at 2 in the afternoon when my phone rang. "Vanessa." I looked at Daniel. He nodded. I answered. "Margaret." Her voice was precisely calibrated, warm with a wire in it. "I heard you called Daniel yesterday." I had not called Daniel yesterday. I had called him 10 days ago to arrange Saturday. This meant she was watching his call logs, or he had told her, or she had some other access to his communication I didn't know about. All three options were informative. I did, I said pleasantly. We had lunch today. A pause. Of course. I just wanted to. I thought maybe we should talk, you and I. Clear the air. About what? I asked. Another pause. Shorter. She had expected me to fill the silence, and I hadn't. About the other week, she said. What you saw. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I said nothing. Richard and I were close naturally. He's going to be my father-in-law. Sometimes things can look. Vanessa, I said. I appreciate the call. Let's speak after the wedding. I ended the call. Daniel was watching me. A small expression moved across his face. Something like respect. Something like relief. That evening, Richard came to me. He had clearly spoken with Vanessa because his approach had the structure of a conversation designed by committee. He was reasonable, measured, apologetic in the precise amounts. Enough to signal remorse, not enough to constitute admission. He said it had been a mistake. He said it was over. He said he would go to counseling if I wanted. He did not mention the messages on the tablet, which told me he didn't know I had seen them, which meant Vanessa had not told him what she suspected I knew. Good. I need more time, I told him. Give me until after the wedding. Daniel needs this wedding to go smoothly. Richard looked at me with the quiet relief of a man granted another reprieve. He thanked me. He went to bed. I sat in the kitchen and thought about what my son had told me, and about the 90 people who would arrive in Vermont in 5 days, and about the barn with the white lights that Vanessa had chosen. And I felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, something that was not grief or anger. It was anticipation. The 4 days between Saturday and the wedding were quiet on the surface, and underneath them the current ran fast. Vanessa's next approach came on Monday, unexpectedly gracious. She arrived at the house, my house, Richard's and mine, without calling ahead, carrying a box of pastries from a bakery in the city, and wearing an expression I recognized as her company face. Open, warm, arranged for maximum reassurance. Richard was out. I think she timed it that way. I let her in because refusing would have told her more than I wanted her to know. I put the pastries on the counter and made tea and sat across from her in the kitchen, which by that point had hosted more significant conversations than any room deserved. I want to apologize, Vanessa said. She was good at this. I want to be precise about that. She was genuinely skilled. The apology had weight and texture. She described feeling confused, emotionally overwhelmed, having made terrible choices, being ashamed. She looked at her hands when the shame came up, which was the right visual detail. She did not over-explain. She did not under-explain. She had calibrated this very carefully. I love Daniel, she said. Whatever else has happened, I want you to know that. I looked at her. I believe you believe that, I said. A small hesitation. What does that mean? It means I think this is a complicated situation, and I think we all need time to let things settle before the wedding. I picked up my tea. How are you feeling about the ceremony? She blinked. The subject change was not what she expected. She had prepared for a conversation about the affair, about Richard, about forgiveness and family and the future. She had not prepared for me to ask about table settings. It's going to be beautiful, she said, recovering. The barn looks incredible. I think everyone will have a wonderful time. I think so too, I said. She left 30 minutes later with nothing she had come for. The call from Richard came that same evening. His version of the olive branch was more direct. He suggested couples counseling, mentioned a therapist a colleague had recommended, said he wanted to rebuild. His voice had the rough sincerity of a man who had decided sincerity was his strongest available play. "Let's talk after the wedding," I said again. "We're both too close to it right now." "Margaret, Richard, I need this week to be about Daniel. Can you give me that?" He said yes. After I hung up, I sat with the quiet for a moment, and then I called Carol. Carol Hutchins had been my closest friend for 22 years. We had met at a hospital administrators conference in 1993, raised our children in parallel, supported each other through a combined total of 5 job changes, 2 cancer diagnoses, 4 parent deaths, and more marital turbulence than either of us would admit in polite company. She lived 40 minutes away in Westport, and she was the most discreet person I had ever known. I drove to her house that evening. I didn't tell Richard where I was going, which I had never done before in 38 years of marriage. That small act of omission felt significant. Carol listened to everything. She sat in her living room with her feet tucked under her and a glass of wine in her hand, and she listened to all of it. The sofa, the tablet, Barbara Sloan, Daniel's investigator, the plan for the wedding. Without interrupting, without editorializing until I finished. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" This is why Carol had been my closest friend for 22 years. "I need a witness," I said. "Someone who knows the full picture, who can verify the timeline if it ever comes to that, legally or otherwise." "Done," she said. "What else?" "I need someone to tell me I'm not losing my mind." She looked at me over her wine glass. "Margaret," she said, "you are the most clear-headed person I know. You were clear-headed when you got your diagnosis in 2016, and you're clear-headed now. The only difference is, this time someone else deserves what's coming to them." I drove home in the dark feeling something I hadn't felt in 3 weeks. Held. Not rescued, not fixed, just held. The way you feel when one other person in the world knows exactly where you are. The wedding was in 4 days. Daniel had texted me that afternoon. "Everything is set. You know what to do at the reception. Trust me." I did trust him. That was perhaps the one thing in my life I had not lost. 2 days before the wedding, they came together. I don't know if they planned it as a coordinated appearance or if it simply happened that way. Vanessa arriving while Richard was home, and one of them deciding that together was stronger than separate. Either way, at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday, I found them both in my living room. Richard sat in his usual chair. Vanessa sat on the sofa, the same sofa where I had found them 6 weeks ago. Neither of them seemed to register the symbolism of this, or if they did, they were past caring about it. "We need to have a real conversation," Richard said. "All right," I said. I sat down. What followed was the most sophisticated piece of joint manipulation I had been subjected to in 63 years of life, and I had worked in hospital administration, which is not a field lacking in manipulation. Richard led. He was sorry. He was deeply sorry. The affair was over, completely. He wanted me to know that, and he looked at Vanessa as though inviting her to confirm this, and she did, with composed sincerity. He wanted to repair the marriage. He understood that trust had been broken, but, and here was the seam in the fabric, he was worried that I was considering taking actions that would harm Daniel, specifically that I had spoken to an attorney. He didn't know this for certain, he said carefully, but he had heard something. He had heard something, meaning Vanessa or someone she knew had seen me outside Barbara Sloan's office in Hartford. "I want us to think about Daniel," Richard said, "about what this wedding means to him, about what happens if family tensions spill over into the ceremony. He's worked so hard for this. Vanessa has worked so hard." Vanessa took this as her cue. She spoke about Daniel's happiness, about the future, about how much it would mean to him to have his parents present and united. She was persuasive. She was almost sincere enough to make me doubt myself for the space of about 4 seconds. Then she said, I think we all know that nothing good comes from dragging things out. Whatever has happened between Richard and me, it was a mistake. And mistakes are better buried than excavated. Mistakes are better buried than excavated. She said this to a woman who had photographed 38 pages of text messages, retained a family attorney, and whose son had a private investigator's report in a folder on his desk. I appreciate you both coming, I said. I really do. And I hear what you're saying. Richard relaxed slightly. Too soon. But I'm afraid I can't make any commitments right now, I said. Not before the wedding. Let's all just focus on getting through the weekend. Vanessa's expression did something in that moment. A shift. Very small. Very fast. Like a light changing in a room. The warmth reorganized itself into something else. Something older and less patient. Margaret, she said, and her voice had dropped. I hope you understand what's at stake. For everyone. Daniel loves you. He would be devastated if someone disrupted what he's built. It was a threat in the syntax of concern. The someone in that sentence was me. The disruption she was describing was mine. I understand completely, I said. We've all made choices, she continued, and now the warmth was entirely gone, replaced by a directness that was almost, in its own way, honest. Choices have consequences, and some consequences are easier to manage quietly than publicly. Richard said her name sharply. She stopped. They looked at each other. We should go, he said. He stood. She stood. They left my house together, and I locked the front door behind them and stood in the entryway. I was afraid. I want to say that clearly because I think honesty requires it. I was 63 years old, and I had just watched my husband and my son's fiancée operate in coordinated bad faith in my own living room. And beneath all my composure and strategy and careful planning, there was a genuine human fear. Fear that I would get this wrong. Fear that Daniel's plan would fail. Fear that Vanessa, who had clearly done this before, was more skilled at this kind of thing than my son and I understood. But here is what I have learned in 63 years about fear. It is information. It tells you that something real is at stake. And when something real is at stake, the correct response is not retreat. I went to my kitchen. I made dinner. And I thought very carefully about Saturday. The barn in Vermont was exactly as Vanessa had designed it. White lights strung across old timber beams, round tables draped in ivory linen, flowers in shades of blush and cream. It was beautiful in the way that very controlled things are beautiful. Nothing left to chance, nothing genuinely wild. 90 people filled the chairs. Carol sat in the third row and caught my eye when I came in and gave me a single small nod. Richard sat beside me in the family row. He had dressed well, the new shirt, the better-fitted jacket. He smelled of the cologne he wore for important occasions. He had put his hand briefly on my knee when we sat down, and I had let it rest there, because removing it would have communicated something, and I was not yet ready to communicate anything. The ceremony was civil and well executed. The officiant was a friend of Daniel's from college. The vows were read. Vanessa stood at the front of the barn in a dress that had cost more than our first car, and she looked radiant. And she looked at Daniel with an expression of such practiced love that I thought again. She is good at this. She is genuinely skilled. Daniel looked at her quietly, the way he looked at everything important. And I watched my son, who had known for 6 weeks, who had said nothing, who had carried this with a composure that made my throat tighten, say his vows in a clear voice. And I thought, whatever happens next, he is going to be all right. He was made right. They were pronounced married. Applause. The white lights swayed slightly in the draft from the barn doors opening. The reception began. At 7:15, 40 minutes into dinner, Daniel stood and tapped his glass for the first toast. This was not unusual. Groom's toast. But Daniel had also, I knew, arranged something else. A small audio/visual setup that the venue's coordinator had been briefed on, described as a tribute video. The coordinator had a laptop. The slideshow screen at the front of the barn had been there all day. Daniel welcomed everyone. He thanked the venue, the officiant, the guests. He spoke about love and commitment with the directness that was simply how he spoke. And then he said, "Before we celebrate, I want to share something with everyone here, because the people in this room are the people I trust most in the world, and I believe they deserve honesty." Richard went still beside me. Vanessa, at the head table, shifted in her seat. Daniel nodded to the coordinator. The screen at the front of the barn displayed a series of documents. They were clear and large enough for everyone in the room to read. The first was the private investigator's report, a formal document with dates, locations, and photographs. The photographs showed Richard and Vanessa outside a restaurant in Hartford, in a hotel lobby in Providence, in a parking lot in New Haven. The room became very quiet in the way that 90 people becoming simultaneously still makes a particular kind of silence. "I found out 6 weeks ago," Daniel said, "that my father has been in a relationship with the woman I married today for approximately 7 months. I also found out, more recently, that Vanessa has a documented history of similar arrangements intended to produce financial settlements. A previous engagement in Boston 4 years ago. There are court records." The second set of documents appeared on the screen. The Boston records. Vanessa stood up. "Daniel," her voice had the same calibration she had used with me, warm, managed, designed for the room. "This is... You need to stop. This is our wedding. You don't know what you're..." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Daniel said, and his voice was so entirely calm that it was its own kind of devastation. "I know what every photograph shows. I know what the investigator found. I know what was in the text messages my mother photographed from my father's tablet." The room turned toward me, 90 pairs of eyes. Richard stood up, and this is where they lost. Not because the evidence was presented, though the evidence was thorough and clear. They lost because of what happened next. Because Richard, who had managed surfaces for 38 years, looked at his son presenting evidence in a barn full of family and friends, and he lost his composure. He said Daniel was being dramatic. He said the photographs were out of context. He said I had clearly poisoned the situation. That Margaret, he said, using my name the way you use someone's name when you want to dismiss them, had decided to destroy the family. And Vanessa, who had been so careful, so calibrated, stepped in front of him and looked at Daniel and said, in the silence of a barn full of 90 people who were watching very carefully, "You don't understand what we have. You never did." The room absorbed this. What we have. The present tense, the possessive. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "That's actually why I waited until after the ceremony." He paused. "My attorney will be in touch on Monday about the annulment. The prenuptial agreement you signed last month protects my assets in the event of demonstrated infidelity. You'll want to review it." He sat down. I looked at my hands. Outside, through the barn's high windows, the Vermont night was very dark and very cold, and the stars were the stars they had always been. The annulment was filed on Monday, as Daniel had said it would be. The prenuptial agreement, which Vanessa had signed 5 weeks before the wedding in a meeting with Daniel's attorney, was precisely what Daniel had described. In the event of documented infidelity occurring before or during the marriage, Vanessa was entitled to nothing. The documentation existed in volume. The private investigator's report ran to 43 pages. The photographs from my husband's tablet, obtained and transferred to Daniel's attorney, via a chain of custody that Barbara Sloan had helped me establish, were admissible as evidence of the affair's timeline. Vanessa retained an attorney. Her attorney was expensive and well regarded, and began with what I understood to be a standard set of arguments. She would contest the characterization of the relationship with Richard, challenge the prenuptial agreement's enforceability, and explore whether my acquisition of the tablet evidence was legally permissible. The contest lasted 11 days. Her attorney withdrew from the case at the end of those 11 days, which is what attorneys do when they conclude that their client's position is indefensible and her resources insufficient to sustain a prolonged fight. I later learned, through Barbara, who had colleagues in overlapping legal circles, that Vanessa had approached 2 other firms before accepting that no one with credible standing would take the case on contingency. She had expected, I think, that the marriage certificate itself would be leverage. She had not expected a prenuptial agreement she had signed without reading carefully enough. And she had not expected a family that had done its homework before she had a chance to do hers. Vanessa was left with the dress she had worn at her wedding, the credit card debt she had accumulated in the months prior, and the quiet implosion of a scheme that had required nearly 2 years of sustained effort to construct. She left Connecticut within the month. I don't know where she went, and I did not spend significant time wondering. Richard was harder, because Richard was still my husband, and 38 years cannot simply be set aside, even when they should be. I filed for divorce in the 3rd week of November. This was not an impulsive act. I had spoken with Barbara Sloan. I had thought carefully about the financial implications. I had had a long and honest conversation with Daniel, who supported the decision without drama. The divorce proceeded under Connecticut's equitable distribution laws. Richard retained his professional accounts and his personal investments. I retained my retirement accounts, my savings, and, after a negotiation that took 4 months and was handled by 2 attorneys in a room I did not enter, the house in Connecticut, Richard moved to an apartment in New Haven. He called me once, 3 weeks after the papers were served, and said he was sorry. He meant it, in the way that people are genuinely sorry when they have done something that has cost them dearly. I accepted the apology for what it was worth, which was less than he hoped and more than nothing. The social consequences were not something I administered or encouraged. They were simply what followed from 90 people having witnessed the barn in Vermont. Richard's professional circle, architects, clients, colleagues of 20 years, contracted around him with the specific quietness of people who don't know what to say. Several clients whose projects were in early stages transitioned to other firms. His professional reputation did not collapse. It diminished, which for a man who had built his identity on it was perhaps equivalent. Within our extended family, the story spread the way these things do. Imperfectly, in fragments, with distortions at the edges. Richard's sister called me twice. The first call was defensive on his behalf. The second, a month later, was simply sad. She said she didn't know what to say. I told her she didn't have to say anything. We had always liked each other independent of our shared connection to Richard, and I saw no reason to let that become another casualty. Daniel's role in all of this, the 6 weeks of careful concealment, the prenuptial agreement, the controlled public exposure, was known within the family and among close friends. The assessment varied. Some people thought he had been cold in his execution. Some people thought he had been precise in a situation that required precision. Daniel himself said very little about it. He went back to work 2 weeks after the wedding. He was, as I have always known him to be, steady. I thought about whether I had done the right things. Not the right strategy, but the right things morally. I had gathered evidence from a tablet left open in my husband's study. I had withheld information from my son until he revealed he already had it. I had participated in a plan that exposed two people in front of 90 guests at what appeared to be a wedding. I decided I had, not without cost, not without complexity, but yes, I had protected my son with the information I had, using the tools available to me, with the goal of giving him the best possible chance at a clean exit from something designed to harm him. The public exposure was not cruelty. It was record. 90 witnesses to a documented truth. By December, I was alone in the Connecticut house for the first time in 38 years. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. Outside, the garden was bare, but the rose canes were still there, still intact, waiting for spring with the patience of things that have survived many winters. I was 63 years old. I had just ended a marriage, survived a scheme, and watched my son demonstrate a quality of character I had always hoped I had given him. I thought, this is enough. This is, in fact, quite a lot. A year passed, and then another, and I would like to tell you what a year can do. By the following spring, I had repainted the kitchen. Not because the old color was wrong. It wasn't. But because I wanted to choose for myself without consultation, without negotiation, without the small daily frictions of shared decision-making that I had not known I was tired of until they were gone. I chose a color called pale eucalyptus that Richard would have found too eccentric, and that I found exactly right. I started teaching a garden design workshop at the community center on Tuesday evenings. 7 people showed up the first week, 14 the fourth week. I was not a professional horticulturalist. I was a person who knew what grew and what didn't and why, which turns out to be enough to be useful. Carol came for dinner on Fridays, sometimes with her husband Tom, sometimes just the two of us. We cooked badly and laughed a great deal and drank wine that was slightly too expensive for the occasion. These evenings were among the best hours of my week. Daniel was well. He had moved apartments, out of the place he had shared with Vanessa, into something smaller in a neighborhood he actually liked, with more light and fewer staging decisions made by someone else. He went to therapy for several months, which he told me about directly and without embarrassment. He said it was useful. He ran in a half marathon in the spring and called me from the finish line, out of breath and laughing. He met someone in the fall, a woman named Grace, who worked as a pediatric physical therapist, and who, the first time I met her at Daniel's apartment, looked at the photos on his wall and asked about each one, with a curiosity that was not performed. She had a calm, practical quality that reminded me of Daniel, which made me like her immediately, and then slightly unnerved me because I wasn't sure what that meant. It meant they were well matched, I concluded. That was enough. By the following spring, they were talking about the future, in the unguarded way people talk about things they actually believe in. Richard's life was quieter than it had been. The architectural practice continued in reduced form. He had 2 or 3 reliable clients and managed well enough financially, but the ease of his former professional confidence had not returned. He was working harder for less, which was its own reckoning. He had begun, according to Carol's network of mutual acquaintances, attending a men's support group on Thursday evenings. Something I had never imagined Richard doing, which made me feel something complicated. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like he was finally dealing with something real. Vanessa, I learned through Barbara Sloan's office, who heard it from a colleague in Boston, had attempted something similar 9 months after the Connecticut situation. A different city, a different man, a broadly similar structure. The Boston connection from her previous case had left a record, however, and the new fiancé's family had conducted due diligence that Vanessa had not anticipated. The engagement ended before any marriage occurred. There were legal proceedings related to financial misrepresentation that I understood to be ongoing. I did not take pleasure in this in the way that movies suggest you should. What I felt was something more like the consequences were proportionate. The world had been, in this case, appropriately organized. That was all. In April, on a morning when the yellow roses were just beginning, Daniel drove up and helped me build a new raised bed in the garden's east corner, the spot that got afternoon sun and had always been underused. We worked for 3 hours. He was not a skilled gardener, but he was capable and willing, which is most of what gardening requires. We talked about Grace. We talked about what he was considering doing with his career. We talked about very little of consequence and a great deal that mattered. At one point he said, without preamble, "You were so calm through all of it. I don't know how you did that." I pushed the last of the soil into place. "I wasn't calm," I said. "I was just slow about the panic." He laughed. It was a good laugh. His laugh, the one I had known for 31 years. I am 65 now. The kitchen is pale eucalyptus. The garden has a new bed in the east corner. On Friday evenings, Carol comes for dinner. And on Sunday mornings, Daniel sometimes calls, still, without fail. I did not get the life I had planned for this phase, but I got something I had not expected. A life that was, in the most basic sense, mine. Chosen, arranged, and tended by myself, for myself, without apology. That turned out to be more than enough. Here's what I learned. Trust what you see, not what you're told to see, not what's convenient to see. What you actually, plainly, clearly see. I saw something on that sofa and I trusted it, even when everything in me wanted to find another explanation. And I learned that the most powerful thing a person can do when they are hurt is to slow down, think clearly, and refuse to act from the wound alone. I did not always do this perfectly, but I tried. What would you have done? If you had walked into that room, if you had read those messages, if you had sat across from two people who believed they were smarter than you, what would you have done? I'd love to know. Leave your answer in the comments, and if this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. It meant more than you know.